I'm delighted that our next guest is a frequent guest on this program, the unconventional economist Leith van Onselen. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Pleasure. Now, you were talking to us about the iron ore mine in Africa. What's the situation generally in relation to iron ore in Australia and China?
Yeah, so iron ore is Australia's biggest export. So it's the number one export in Australia, beats coal, beats natural gas, etc. And what's basically happened is since the mid-2000s, we've had this ginormous terms of trade boom, which basically meant that the global iron ore price rocketed. And it rocketed on the back of China. So China effectively started building, began its massive building program, etc. And that boosted demand for global iron ore and it pushed up iron ore prices. And Australia was one of the big beneficiaries of that. So our major miners like Fortescue, BHP, Rio, etc., made absolutely unbelievable profits selling iron ore to the world. And Australia was the biggest iron ore exporter. And we obviously, the federal government benefited to the tune of around $100 billion per year from not just iron ore, but also commodity, more broader commodity exports in terms of extra company tax revenues, etc. And the problem that we're facing is that the iron ore market is now facing a kind of day of reckoning, I guess. And it's going to play out over, not instantly, but over the next few years. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, China has funded a ginormous iron ore mine in Africa. It's called Sinamdu. I probably mispronounced that. I'm sorry if I did. But that iron ore mine is projected to dump around 100 million tonnes per annum of iron ore from next year. And that would make Africa effectively the third biggest iron ore producer after Australia and Brazil. And that has the potential to obviously massively increase the supply of iron ore into the global market and tank the iron ore price. At the same time, China is sort of going through an ex-growth phase whereby it's done its massive amount of building, it's built all its cities up, it's used a huge amounts of iron ore to create steel to basically industrialise itself. And that process is kind of starting to come to an end, which means that the demand for iron ore from China is likely to fall as it becomes less steel intensive. And then a further headwind is that China is now producing more steel through recycling, which is also reduces its need for iron ore. So I think, David, the long and the short of it is that Australia faces some major headwinds with iron ore, and it means that the global iron ore price, both through rising supply and falling demand from China, is likely to fall.
How do you think
and fall quite heavily?
How do you think this is going to affect?
When it does, it means the federal budget get hit.
How do you think this is going to affect the average Australian in the medium term?
So the way it affects it's obviously very indirect. So, the average Australian is not going to know that all this stuff's going on. The way it will affect them is it will affect them through the federal budget. So effectively, the federal budget will receive less tax revenue through corporate taxes. And as a result, that means there'll be less money available for tax cuts, for government services, for welfare, all those sorts of things. So that's basically the way that the average punter, the average taxpayer will be affected.
One of the problems, Leith, I think you'd agree, is that the federal government seems to waste an extraordinary amount of money. The Australian taxpayers don't see much benefit from the vast wealth that the government has been making. You've been making that point for some time.
Yeah, and it's sort of twofold issue. So first of all, although we've had this windfall, obviously, from the terms of trade boom, we haven't had nearly enough of a windfall. So, we haven't copied what Norway did, but what Qatar did, and all these other countries that have done it properly, and we haven't taxed our resources properly. So, although we've made money from extra corporate taxes, we don't really have a proper resource rent taxes. We do have some state-based mining royalties, etc. So we do get some money, but we don't get nearly enough. And we certainly don't tax other areas like, LNG and gas, which I've talked about previously. So as a result, we haven't had a commensurate uplift in our revenue commensurate with our increase in exports. And now, obviously, that process is reversing anyway. And then I'd also add that we then dilute our mineral wealth by running a huge immigration policy. So, Australia's population has grown by about 8.3 million people this century, mostly through immigration. And then that has effectively diluted our mineral wealth because you're then spreading your mineral wealth over more people. And then to add insult to injury, we then obviously have, very high spending in certain areas, like the NDIS is a classic example, which costs currently just over 40 billion a year and is projected to rise to 100 billion in 10 years. And there's big question marks about how that can be funded when we have shrinkage in, our revenues from things like iron ore. So it does put the federal budget in a long-term precarious position.
You've been a long-standing critic of the massive immigration that this government has been involved in. I noticed that the media generally noticed this yesterday. There was a piece in the Telegraph, and then that spread to the television media, which is usually pretty silent on this. I think Australians, if they haven't noticed already, will realise that immigration has been out of control, has it not, in terms of what we need, and particularly the housing and the hospitals and the schools and so on that we can provide to people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd argue that Labor lost control of the border. So just to put that into perspective, the Labor government's first federal budget in October 2022 projected net overseas migration of 470,000 over its first 2 years. Instead, we got around 1 million. So effectively, we received more than double the number of migrants that Labor initially projected in its first budget. And as a result, we've had an extra roughly 500,000 people land in Australia. And that is principally why we have a rental crisis right now, because an extra 500,000 people obviously need housing. They need infrastructure, they need all this other stuff. And we haven't been able to build enough houses. In fact, the number of houses that we've built has actually been falling because of, high construction costs and building, because of the pandemic, labour shortages, builders having to compete for labour against state government big build infrastructure projects, all those sorts of things. And effectively, the federal government has just ramped up immigration too high. And the sad thing is, David, the Labor government projected in its May budget that net overseas migration would fall back to 395,000 last financial year. So we're talking 2023-24. But all the data that we've received this year from the Australian Bureau of Statistics through its monthly net permanent long-term arrivals data, which is basically proxy for net overseas migration. The official figures won't be out for another 6 months. But that showed that we're still getting record numbers of migrants in. So, for example, in the first 5 months of this year, according to the monthly figures, we received a net 243,000 net permanent long-term arrivals. And that's up from about 209,000 last year, which was a record year. So that to me tells you that immigration's still running hot and it's not falling anywhere near as quickly as the Albanese government promised, merely 6 months ago when it said that they're going to halve migration. So that is principally why we have a rental crisis right now, because they let in an extra 500,000 people, more than they projected, and immigration isn't coming down like they projected.
Do you think that a good part of this, and I've suspected this for years, a good part of this is Treasury and the government thinking, well, if you bring in large numbers of immigrants, this increases the total gross domestic product. It reduces the product per capita, but it increases the total, and that's a good statistic for a government to have. Is some of this just for that pure purpose of having a good statistic in relation to the GDP?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a twofold issue. Treasury has two key performance indicators. One of them is obviously the federal budget, and the other one is to keep the economy growing overall in aggregate. And immigration helps both those things. So the federal government collects about 80% of the nation's tax revenue, mostly through personal and company taxes. And immigration helps those two things directly. So obviously, if you bring in an extra 500,000 people over 2 years, as I said, most of those people are going to work, which means they're going to pay personal income tax. They're also going to spend, which means if you're, Harvey Norman or whatever, you'll make more profit. And those two things boost the federal government's tax take. They also boost the overall economic pie, because you've got an extra 500,000 people spending and, creating economic activity, which grows the overall pie. But obviously the thing that matters is the slice of the pie. And also, whilst the federal budget benefits, the state governments and local governments suffer because they only collect 20% of the tax revenue, and they're obviously the ones who provide most of the infrastructure and services for the growing population. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a system whereby Treasury gets the gains. It privatises the gains through higher overall growth and through increased federal tax revenue, while the costs are, socialised on everyone else through degraded standard of living, congestion, all those sorts of things, the pressure on state budgets, etc. So, yes, I think Treasury is the puppet master behind Australia's big migration.
Aren't we lucky then? Aren't we lucky that we don't have a land frontier like the Americans? And when we see what the Biden and Harris administration has done in relation to bringing in enormous numbers of people across the frontier, I sometimes wonder whether it's also about getting votes, but of course we don't know whether it really is for that purpose. That's just my conjecturing, that governments may well think that if they bring large numbers of migrants in, they'll then vote for the party that brought them in.
Yeah, there could be some of that, but it's also just the easiest way to grow. So, if you're the Albanese government and you want to avoid having a technical recession, the easiest way to stop that is to just grow the population by 2.5%, which is what it's done. And that basically means that it's very hard to have a recession, even though per head we're all going backwards. And, I think governments in general have given up on this notion of actually being productive and having productivity growth. They're instead just going for quantity over quality. And as a result, Australia's productivity growth is deplorable, and living standards are gradually, like a frog being boiled slowly, they're gradually degrading.
So like a frog being boiled slowly, that's very good. So the average Australian is losing out on Treasury and the government, thinking that they've got a statistical advantage. I wonder how much the voters think about that. Yeah. I mean, they know what's going on, and I think that they know from their own experience what's going on, and I don't think they're going to take too much notice of what the politicians say and a media that goes along with that. I
think you're right, David.
Yes. You had an interesting headline in one of your pieces, and that was the Albanese government swindling the Australian people over gas. What was that?
Yeah,
about?
that was interesting. So, the Greens, for all their faults, had a sensible suggestion last month that the East Coast Australia should reserve its gas for domestic use, which is very logical and something I've been championing for a long time, and other sensible people. And our Resource Minister, Madeleine King, immediately said that we can't do that because that would increase Australia's sovereign risk and would, damage our trade relations, etc. And she also said, quote, that if we reserved our gas, quote, we would turn the lights off in countries that need our gas. Meanwhile, she's happy to turn the lights off in Australia by generating a gas shortage. Now, the thing that's ridiculous about David is that China and Japan actually are receiving more of our gas than they need, and they're actually reselling it on the global market. So whilst Australians on the East Coast have been starved and we're paying these super high prices, which is also pushing up electricity costs, the people we sell the gas to, the countries we sell the gas to, has too much of it, and they're reselling it, which is just bizarre. And Madeleine King's comments were particularly bizarre because she has previously praised Western Australia's gas reservation policy multiple times. So the extension of that is, well, if it's good for Western Australia, why isn't it good for East Coast Australia? And one final thing that was very maddening was that, former independent senator for South Australia, Rex Patrick, wrote a piece last week in michaelwest.com.au, it's fantastic, whereby he basically exposed that debate has been shut down deliberately by Labor on gas reservation. So it turns out that the former coalition government, the Morrison government, in their dying days, were looking at gas reservation on the East Coast. They actually commissioned a paper, an investigation, which was released to them in November 2021, Cabinet in confidence, just before the last federal election. And Rex Patrick did a Freedom of Information request to get that released to the public. It was blocked. Rex Patrick then spent $1,200 of his own money to take the issue to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, who was then confronted with an absolute smorgasbord of highly paid taxpayer-funded lawyers from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, etc., who then argued not to release the paper to the public. Unfortunately, they won, and the reason given by the AAT was that it could hurt relations with the people that we sell the gas to, the countries we sell our gas to, like China, Japan, Singapore, etc., and they wouldn't be happy if they thought that we were looking at gas reservation. That was the reason we couldn't have this paper released. So here we have the Albanese government deliberately stifling debate on gas reservation and stifling the former government's own analysis of options to reserve our gas, which to me tells you that the Albanese government cares more about the welfare of residents in Asia than it does residents in its own country who it has sworn to serve. And we are their constituents. They should be looking after Australians first. They are Australian politicians, and yet they seem to care more about residents in Asia and, delivering cheap gas to residents of Asia rather than cheap gas to their own countrymen, which to me is just deplorable.
And deplorable too that the AAT, Australian Administrative Tribunal, would swallow such a weak case. I find that appalling too.
Oh, it is. And look, to his credit, Rex Patrick is a patriot. So he spent $1,200 of his own money to try and get this report, a government report that taxpayers paid for, released to the public, as it should be. But, the AAT was swamped by highly paid, government-paid lawyers to not have it released to the public. And unfortunately, they sided with these lawyers and the Albanese government and wouldn't do it because it could create some, some embarrassment amongst foreign governments. Because, how dare Australia actually reserve enough gas for its own residents first? I mean, it is absurd. Can you imagine, the Saudi Arabian government saying, no, you must pay $2 a litre for your petrol because we have to ensure that Americans and Australians, actually not $2, so we say $2.50 to $3 because we pay more than what these countries pay. You must pay that much for your petrol because we've got to make sure that we send our oil overseas first before we can actually have petrol at home. That is essentially what the Australian government has done. It's bizarre.
Yes.
And, it's quite frankly ridiculous. One of the reasons why we've got stubbornly high inflation. We have high cost of living crisis, and we've also got manufacturers going broke left, right and centre because energy costs are artificially high, and we've turned a comparative advantage into a disadvantage.
Well, how creditable and patriotic of Rex Patrick, former senator and former submariner, to do that. And I think anybody who's willing to go around in a submarine to serve their time in a submarine is obviously a very courageous person. I would find it extremely claustrophobic. But thank you so much for your contribution and for your very excellent site and newsletter, which really tells us what's going on in this country. Thank you, Leith van Onselen.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll speak to you next time.
Certainly.